Imagine walking through endless corridors of marble, cold, smooth, and whispering beneath your feet. The air smells of rosewater and smoke, and somewhere beyond the silk curtains, a woman laughs, or perhaps cries. The sound dies before you can tell which. The light of oil lamps trembles on the gilded walls, as if afraid to reveal what lies behind them. Before we slip further into this hidden world, take a moment. If you're watching this from Cairo, from Jakarta, from London, or perhaps from Istanbul itself, think of how far these stories have traveled. Empires fall, languages die, but human curiosity endures. If you love uncovering the forgotten corners of history, lend this story your curiosity, your time, and subscribe. Let's see how many of us across the world can bring these ghosts back to light. Inside the imperial harem, the world moved to a rhythm unlike anywhere else in the empire. It was a place where silence was a form of power, and every sound, an anklet's jingle, a whispered greeting, carried consequence. Most imagined the harem as a paradise of pleasure. Hundreds of women draped in silk, perfumed and idle. But that illusion belonged to poets and spies. In truth, it was a golden cage, governed not by lust but by fear, hierarchy, and ritual. At the heart of this labyrinth stood men who were neither fully men nor entirely slaves, the eunuchs. To outsiders, they were pitied or mocked. Inside these walls, they were the law. Every entrance, every letter, every gaze between a concubine and a guard passed through them. Their eyes were always open, their desires surgically removed. The most powerful among them was the Kuzlar Aga, the chief black eunuch, who controlled the flow of life between the Sultan's quarters and the world outside. His authority reached beyond the harem, into politics, religion, even espionage. He could make or unmake viziers with a whisper. To serve him was to dwell in danger and proximity to divine power. When a new concubine entered the palace, often a frightened girl from the Balkans or the Caucasus, she was first greeted not by the Sultan, but by these eunuchs. They examined her posture, her voice, her obedience. They watched her like gardeners tending to rare, fragile blooms. The girls called them agas, and to displease one was to risk everything. A French ambassador once wrote in 1670, "The Sultan's women do not speak without his eunuch's permission, nor weep without their notice." The harem, he observed, was a world of glances. A look could elevate you, or destroy you. Among the black eunuchs, whispers spread faster than the wind. Some had learned the Sultan's moods better than his own mother. Others trafficked in secrets, smuggling letters between the powerful women who battled for the Sultan's favor. There were rivalries, silent wars fought through perfume bottles laced with poison, or messages hidden beneath embroidery. One evening in the late 17th century, the palace lanterns burned low as Kusum Sultan, the most formidable woman the Ottoman Empire had ever known, sat alone in her chamber. The chief eunuch entered, bowing deeply. He said nothing, but she saw it in his eyes. Her enemies had made their move. Within hours, she would be strangled with her own silken scarf by men she once commanded. And when her body was carried away, it was the eunuchs, her old allies, who ensured her silence was complete. Power in the harem was like the scent of jasmine in summer, sweet, heavy, and suffocating. The eunuchs enforced the Sultan's will, yet also protected the women who defied him. They existed between worlds, wielding authority in both but belonging to neither. The irony was cruel. Men rendered powerless over their own bodies became masters over the most intimate domain of an empire. Their lives were measured in service, their reward, trust, and in that trust they built invisible empires. Many eunuchs grew wealthy, owning estates, endowing mosques, even influencing succession. Some were devout, reciting prayers in hushed tones beneath the domes of Topkapi. Others turned to intrigue, weaving webs of loyalty and betrayal. It was said the chief black eunuch's chamber was filled with petitions, pleas from viziers, sultanas, and imams. None dared bypass him. The Sultan himself relied on his counsel, believing his heart too mutilated for ambition. But ambition, in silence, grows teeth. Those who saw the eunuch's procession through the palace described it as haunting. Bare feet on stone floors, dark robes swaying like shadows, faces expressionless. They carried keys, dozens of them, each representing a door they alone could open. Keys to rooms of laughter, tears, conspiracy. Keys to the Sultan's deepest secrets. There were moments when even the Sultan hesitated before crossing their guarded thresholds. For within the harem, surrounded by the scent of musk and the flutter of silk, the Sultan was not the most powerful man. He was, in a way, their prisoner too. By the 18th century, the influence of the black eunuchs reached beyond the palace walls. They brokered marriages, managed charitable endowments, and whispered into the ears of ministers. In the shadows, they steered the course of an empire that believed them voiceless. And yet, history remembers them without names. Their graves are few, their faces forgotten. The chroniclers who recorded the conquests of sultans and viziers left only vague mentions. A eunuch, the aga, the servant. But their fingerprints remain on every law, every intrigue, every vanished rival who dared to challenge the harem's order. Late at night, the palace grew quiet. Only the faint sound of a key turning in a lock echoed through the corridors. A eunuch passed by, lamp in hand, his shadow stretching across walls painted with faded lilies. He paused before a door, listening. On the other side, a woman whispered a prayer, or perhaps a curse. He turned the key, closed the lamp, and vanished into the dark. In the stillness that followed, the harem seemed to breathe, alive, aware, and eternal. Because in this place even silence had a master. The marble halls of Topkapi shimmered like frozen rivers beneath the glow of oil lamps. Fragrant smoke from burning amber drifted through carved lattice screens, curling around mosaics that had seen centuries of secrets. Somewhere deep within, a woman's laughter slipped through the corridors, soft, musical, and gone too soon, as though the air itself had devoured it. The silence that followed was not peace, but surveillance. For every breath taken inside the imperial harem was measured, watched, and recorded by those who had no voices of their own. To the world beyond the palace gates, the Ottoman harem was a fantasy. Poets imagined a paradise of silks and perfumes, where sultans reclined among beautiful captives. But behind the gilt doors, the truth was colder, heavier. The harem was an empire within an empire, its politics sharper than any blade, and at its center stood the eunuchs, men whose mutilation had become their power. They were not born in Istanbul. Most were children once, taken from the far reaches of Africa or the Caucasus, sold into slavery and delivered into the Sultan's possession. They entered the palace as boys and emerged as something entirely different, instruments of order and control. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to desire, forbidden to exist beyond service, and yet through that obedience they became indispensable. The most feared among them was the Kuzlar Aga, the chief black eunuch. He controlled access to the Sultan's family, to his wives, his concubines, and even his mother, the Valid Sultan. With a nod, he could decide who lived in comfort and who vanished into oblivion. The women of the harem learned to watch his footsteps, to read the faintest twitch of his expression, for he was both messenger and judge. When new girls arrived, captives from wars, daughters sold by desperate fathers, or slaves purchased from distant markets, it was the eunuchs who greeted them. Their task was to prepare the girls for the Sultan's world. They inspected their posture, their speech, their purity. They instructed them in the ways of courtly grace and silent submission. Their hands never lingered, but their eyes missed nothing. Every misstep was noted, every spark of rebellion quietly extinguished. A Venetian visitor once wrote that, in the harem, even a smile is currency. That was not poetic exaggeration. The slightest show of favor could elevate a woman from servitude to royal consort, and the eunuchs were the gatekeepers of that transformation. They carried the Sultan's gifts, his orders, his punishments. Their presence was constant, ghost-like, always near but never acknowledged. And among the women, alliances brewed like poison. Concubines vied for influence, each hoping to bear the Sultan's heir. The Valid Sultan, his mother, often orchestrated these rivalries like a general commanding her armies. Behind her veil, she maneuvered eunuchs as her loyal agents. It was said that the most powerful of them could read her will before she spoke it. In one winter of the 17th century, the palace awoke to whispers that a favorite concubine had fallen ill. Servants said she had been poisoned. Her tea, once scented with cloves, had carried the faintest trace of bitter almond. No one would speak aloud who had ordered it. The Kuzlar Aga personally oversaw the removal of her body, wrapped in silk and carried through a hidden passage. The next morning, the corridors were scrubbed, the air heavy with rosewater, and no one dared to mention her name again. The eunuch's power was paradoxical. They had no children, no legacy, yet they shaped dynasties. They were outsiders, yet they ruled the palace's innermost sanctum. Their authority was built on proximity, on their ability to move between the Sultan and his world of women, to deliver whispers from the harem to the throne room. And the Sultan trusted them precisely because they were broken. Who could be more loyal than a man denied every other life? But loyalty is a fragile thing. Some eunuchs grew wealthy, manipulating petitions and favors. Others used their influence to fund mosques, schools, and charities. The Kuzlar Aga himself often became one of the richest men in the empire. He was master of secrets, protector of sacred relics, and sometimes executioner. When a woman was condemned, it was he who gave the silent signal. The eunuchs carried out the sentence without a word, swift, quiet, invisible. A servant once claimed that on nights of execution, the palace seemed to hold its breath. The lamps burned lower, footsteps echoed longer. Somewhere, behind a locked door, silk rustled one final time. Over the centuries, the eunuch's influence stretched far beyond the harem's walls. They managed endowments, traded information, and even mediated between the Sultan and foreign diplomats. To speak with the chief eunuch was to whisper to the empire's hidden conscience. Yet, despite their power, history would forget them, recording their deeds but not their names. They became shadows, serving shadows. By the dawn of the 19th century, when Western envoys finally glimpsed the harem, they found its eunuchs still standing guard, silent, inscrutable, keys jangling softly at their belts. Those keys opened every door, to rooms of music and sorrow, to cells where disobedient women awaited judgment, to the Sultan's private garden where even the moonlight seemed forbidden to enter. Late at night, when the palace fell quiet, one might hear the slow, deliberate turn of those keys. A eunuch moved down the corridor carrying a dim lantern. The light wavered across the tiles, catching his eyes for a moment. Eyes neither cruel nor kind, only tired. He paused before a door, listening. On the other side, a woman murmured in prayer. He said nothing. He turned away. The lock clicked shut, echoing like a heartbeat fading into marble. And in that instant the harem reclaimed its silence, an empire of whispers ruled by men without voices. The marble of Topkapi has long gone cold. The oil lamps that once flickered over silk and steel have been extinguished for centuries. Yet, when the evening wind moves through the empty courtyards, it still seems to carry whispers, soft, untraceable, like the memory of breath. These are the voices of men who no longer exist in name or form, but whose shadows still cling to the bones of an empire. History has little patience for those who served in silence. When the Ottomans fell and the modern world began to write its own stories, the eunuchs of the empire were erased with almost deliberate precision. Their graves were rarely marked, their portraits never painted. Even their ledgers, once filled with the ink of power, were quietly burned or lost. Yet their presence endures. in the foundations of mosques, the endowments of orphanages, and the architecture of control that shaped centuries of Ottoman life. In the beginning, they were instruments of the Sultan's will. By the end, they were the empire's conscience and its cage. The Kuzlar Aga, the chief black eunuch, had risen from a slave brought across the Red Sea to one of the most powerful figures in the Ottoman world. He controlled the harem, yes, but also the waqfs, the vast religious endowments that sustained mosques, hospitals, and schools. Every coin that passed from the Sultan's treasury to charity went through his hand. What began as servitude became sovereignty in disguise. In the mid-17th century, when Kuzlar Aga Uzun Süleyman died, his funeral drew crowds of viziers and courtiers. No sultan attended, none ever did, but the silence of the procession spoke volumes. As his body was carried through the city, people whispered prayers not for his soul, but for the empire's fate. The eunuch's power had been both invisible and absolute. His death felt like the closing of a book whose author no one had dared to name. But not all were mourned. Centuries later, when the winds of reform swept through the empire, the eunuchs became symbols of decay. Western travelers called them the empire's dark heart, and Ottoman reformers sought to erase them in the pursuit of modernity. Yet, even then, the Kuzlar Agas adapted. They transformed their networks into bureaucratic influence, their religious duties into political leverage. The empire could abolish their titles, but it could not erase the habits of obedience and control they had built into its bloodstream. In the twilight years of the 19th century, one final Kuzlar Aga, Hacı Bashir Aga, stood at the crossroads of empire and oblivion. He was a man of immense wealth and quiet intellect, a servant to sultans but a benefactor to the poor. His mosques and schools still stand in Istanbul, their domes gleaming beneath the call to prayer. Yet even he understood the irony of his position. Once, when asked why he built so many charitable works, he reportedly replied, "We build because our blood cannot." It was not self-pity, but confession, the admission of a man whose faith was built upon the ruins of his own body. By then, the empire itself was beginning to resemble its eunuchs, old, scarred, and haunted by its own grandeur. Revolutions stirred in the provinces. The harem's gates creaked open for the last time. The corridors that had once echoed with the rustle of silk now stood empty, the scent of rosewater replaced by dust. A British visitor in 1909 wrote, "The palace feels alive, though no one is there." He spoke of hearing footsteps in the marble halls at night, of glimpsing figures in black robes that vanished when approached. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps memory itself had taken form. The eunuch's influence did not die with the empire. Their legacy was more insidious, embedded in the Ottoman way of governance, the art of secrecy, the theater of obedience, the worship of hierarchy. Long after their bodies were buried, their methods lived on. Ministers and generals adopted the eunuch's quiet diplomacy, their unseen manipulation, their mastery of the invisible chain of command. The empire's modern successors inherited more from them than from any sultan. Yet, for all their power, their humanity remains elusive. No letters, no memoirs, no songs. Only brief mentions in chronicles, always through someone else's eyes. A eunuch entered. The aga spoke. The servant acted. They moved history, yet left no trace of their inner world. Were they loyal or resentful? Did they believe in the empire that mutilated them or merely survive it? History, perhaps, does not want to know. Today, the courtyards of Topkapi still stand. Tourists wander beneath arches once guarded by men who had no heirs. Few realize they are walking over ground where entire lives unfolded in silence, where loyalty was purchased through pain, and obedience became the currency of immortality. In a small cemetery nearby, there are graves with no names, only small stones pressed into the earth. Some say they belong to the eunuchs. Others say they were never buried at all. As dusk settles over the Bosphorus, The last light glances off the domes and towers of the old palace. The muezzin's call rises, echoing through the air once filled with commands and confessions. The empire is gone, but the silence remains. The same silence that once guarded its most sacred secrets. And if you listen closely, when the wind moves just right, you might still hear the soft clink of a key turning in a lock that no longer exists.